While Hollywood has ignored this story, a man who spent 17 years hiding in plain sight committed crimes. So calculated, so cold, and so methodical that investigators themselves struggled to believe the person responsible was living an ordinary suburban life just miles from where he buried his secrets. Rex Heuermann, a licensed architect working in Midtown Manhattan, allegedly murdered at least 8 women and left their remains scattered along a desolate stretch of Long Island Highway. The world needs to know this story, because it exposes how a predator can operate for nearly 2 decades, protected not by luck alone. But Rex Heuermann was born on October 28, 1964, in Long Island, New York. He grew up in the same communities he would later terrorize, giving him an intimate knowledge of the geography that investigators believe he used to his advantage. He attended New York Institute of Technology and built a career as an architect, eventually founding RH Consultants and Associates, a firm based in Midtown Manhattan. By outward appearances, Heuermann was a functioning professional. He maintained a client roster, paid his taxes, and held professional licenses in multiple states. He married Asa Ellerup in 1994, and the couple raised 2 children together in Massapequa Park, a quiet Long Island suburb. Neighbors described him as unusual, but unremarkable, a large, socially awkward man who kept largely to himself. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed over 300 pounds, a physical presence that witnesses would later recall with unease. For nearly 2 decades, Heuermann moved between his professional life in the city and his domestic life on Long Island, while allegedly committing acts of extreme violence against vulnerable women. The double life he maintained was not accidental. Investigators later determined that Heuermann had used burner phones, accessed the dark web, and taken deliberate steps to obscure his activities. He allegedly stalked victims online, studied investigative techniques, and monitored law enforcement communications related to the very case being built against him. The investigation into what became known as the Gilgo Beach murders began in December 2010, when a police officer searching for a missing woman named Shannon Gilbert along Ocean Parkway stumbled upon human remains. What followed was one of the most disturbing discoveries in the history of American law enforcement. Over the course of several weeks, the remains of 10 individuals were recovered along a stretch of Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach on Long Island's South Shore. The scale of what had been hiding in plain sight shocked the nation and ignited an investigation that would take more than a decade to reach its most significant break. The victims discovered along Ocean Parkway in December 2010 and into early 2011 included individuals who had been missing for years, their disappearances largely overlooked by the broader public. Among those identified were Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 4 women who became known collectively as the Gilgo Four. All 4 had advertised escort services on Craigslist, and investigators determined that their killer had likely used those same online platforms to contact them. The remains of additional victims were found nearby, including those of a toddler, a young Asian woman, and others who took years to formally identify. The sheer number of victims and the proximity of the remains to one another suggested a single organized offender who had used the area as a deliberate disposal site. Suffolk County Police initially struggled with the investigation, which was plagued by jurisdictional disputes, leadership changes, and allegations of mismanagement. Years passed with no arrests. Families of the victims publicly criticized law enforcement for what they described as inadequate attention, arguing that the victims' backgrounds led investigators to treat the case with less urgency than it deserved. The case went cold in the eyes of the public. But a dedicated task force continued working behind the scenes. In 2022, Suffolk County District Attorney Raymond Tierney took office and reorganized the investigative team. New forensic tools and a renewed commitment to the case produced results. Investigators used DNA evidence recovered from the crime scenes and cross-referenced it with genetic genealogy databases, the same technology that had helped solve other cold cases across the United States. A critical break came through pizza. Investigators recovered a pizza crust that Heuermann had discarded, and the DNA extracted from it matched genetic material found at the crime scenes. Additionally, hair samples recovered from the remains of victims were matched to Heuermann's wife and daughter through DNA analysis, suggesting the hairs had transferred from Heuermann's home or vehicle to the bodies of his victims. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested outside his Manhattan office building. He was charged with 6 counts of murder in the first and second degree, specifically for the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, and Maureen Brainard Barnes. He pleaded not guilty at his initial arraignment. His wife, Asa Ellerup, filed for divorce within days of his arrest. The international media response was immediate and intense, with coverage spanning news outlets across Europe, Asia, and Australia. The arrest was described by investigators as one of the most significant breakthroughs in American cold case history. As of the time of this documentary's production, Rex Heuermann has been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He admitted to brutally murdering 8 women, a number that exceeded the initial charges brought against him at the time of his arrest. The admission came as investigators continued building their case and as additional charges were filed. Heuermann showed no remorse for his crimes, even after receiving his sentence. Court documents and statements from prosecutors paint a portrait of a man who was meticulous, predatory, and fully aware of the consequences of his actions. Investigators have stated publicly that they believe Heuermann may be responsible for additional crimes beyond those to which he has admitted. The task force assigned to the Gilgo Beach case has not formally closed its investigation, and forensic work on the unidentified remains found along Ocean Parkway continues. The case also raised serious questions about the original 2010 and 2011 investigation. Former Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke, who oversaw early stages of the Gilgo investigation, was later convicted on unrelated federal charges involving obstruction of justice and civil rights violations, raising concerns about the integrity of the initial probe. Legal analysts and victim advocates have called for a formal review of how the case was handled in its earliest years. What the world is watching now is whether additional charges will be filed, whether any of the remaining unidentified victims will be named, and whether law enforcement's use of genetic genealogy in this case will set a legal and ethical precedent for future investigations. The Gilgo Beach murders fundamentally altered the landscape of Long Island, a region that had long prided itself on its quiet suburban identity. The discovery of 10 sets of remains along Ocean Parkway in 2010 and 2011 shattered that image and forced a reckoning with how communities respond when vulnerable individuals go missing. Victim advocacy organizations pointed to the case as a defining example of what critics call the missing white woman syndrome in reverse, arguing that because the victims were women engaged in sex work, their disappearances received insufficient media and law enforcement attention for years. Internationally, the arrest of Heuermann prompted renewed discussion about cold case methodology, the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations, and the responsibilities of online platforms that host adult service advertisements. In the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, law enforcement agencies publicly examined their own cold case protocols in response to the techniques used to break the Gilgo Beach case. The families of the victims have become vocal advocates for legislative change, pushing for laws that would improve the investigation of missing persons cases, regardless of the victim's occupation or background. The case also prompted New York State lawmakers to examine regulations governing genetic genealogy databases and the conditions under which law enforcement agencies may access them. What happens next depends in large part on the ongoing forensic work and whether prosecutors elect to pursue additional charges against Heuermann for the remaining unidentified victims. Hollywood has not touched this story yet, but the real events are more dramatic than any crime movie ever made. The Gilgo Beach case contains every element that studios spend millions of dollars manufacturing. It features a hidden monster living behind a respectable professional facade, a decade-long cold case cracked by a discarded pizza crust, and a community that refused to stop searching for answers. Films about elaborate heists or fictional serial investigators pale against the documented reality of what happened along Ocean Parkway. The scale of Heuermann's alleged crimes, spanning nearly 2 decades and claiming at least 8 confirmed lives, combined with the forensic ingenuity that finally brought him down, represents a story of genuine complexity and consequence. The victims were real people with families who waited years for answers. The investigators were real professionals who refused to abandon a case that many had written off. The courtroom proceedings produced real admissions of guilt. No screenplay has captured this because no screenplay has tried. The story is still unfolding, and perhaps that is exactly why it demands to be told now rather than after the credits roll on some future dramatization. Rex Heuermann's case will be studied by law enforcement agencies, forensic scientists, and criminologists for generations. It exposed critical failures in how society responds to the disappearance of marginalized individuals, and it demonstrated the power of modern forensic science to reach back across decades and deliver accountability. The 10 victims found along Ocean Parkway deserve justice long before 2023, and the families who fought for that justice deserve recognition. This story is not finished. Investigations continue, identities remain unknown, and questions linger. Follow Dark Crime Decoded for stories Hollywood has not told yet.